Hi, everyone. My name is Clara Vonders with Public Citizen. Thank you so much for joining us today, this day, the 10th day of the LA climate fire tragedy. More than 24 people are dead, at least as many are missing. Thousands of schools, homes, businesses are destroyed, and the preliminary damage estimates already exceed $250 billion. And yet, there's still no end in sight. As we all puzzle over the immediate causes of the fire, a dropped cigarette, possible arson, a bad power line, the real culprit is actually on the loose and already stacking kindling for the next fire. Burning fossil fuels is the leading driver of climate change, and the oil and gas industry has spent 50 years engaged in a massive, massive cover up, just like big tobacco did. They've lied and buried the evidence that their products kill and cause illness, and they continue to use their massive political influence to block change in the halls of power. Today, as Californians are dying, big oil is thriving, enjoying unmatched profits, rapid growth, and a promise of anything goes policy under the new administration. Despite the established link between rising fossil fuel emissions and faster, hotter, more destructive fires, social media and the political discourse are rife with misinformation. And it's not an accident. This is just the new chapter in Big Oil's massive disinformation campaign. Just another natural disaster, folks. Nothing to see, nothing to do. Just rebuild and move on. But today, you'll hear from climate survivors who say, no, these are not natural disasters. These are crimes. These everyday Americans believe that by telling their story, they can make a difference. By telling their story, they can inspire someone else to share their own. And together, we'll build 100,000 stories and stitch together a new blueprint for a kinder, gentler world. You'll also hear from a climate attribution scientist who has specifically researched how much the emissions of leading fossil fuel and cement companies are to blame for the fires in the American West. Thankfully, more news stories are connecting the LA fires to the climate crisis. And we want to sincerely thank every journalist who's taking the time to join this call. Now, it's essential for reporters and policymakers alike to take the next step and pull the curtain back on the leading and preventable cause of the climate crisis, which is burning fossil fuels. Before turning to reporter questions, we'll close with an overview of the 3 pathways that climate survivors and their allies are building to ensure that fossil fuel companies are held to account. From polluter pays legislation to civil and criminal litigation strategies. But now let's turn to LA and go to our first speaker, Ms. Danielle Levanas. Danielle?
Hi. Thank you guys for having me here. My name is Danielle Levanas, and I grew up in Pacific Palisades. My parents moved there in 1983 when I was a year old, and until a week ago, that community was the place I associated most with home. Wow, I thought I'd get through it a little further before the tears came. Sorry. Um, I've lived in a number of places so far in my life, but my parents' house was where I felt safest in the world, if we could all be so lucky. When people ask, I've been saying, we lost my family home in the Palisades fire and the neighborhood I grew up in. We lost all our photos before 2008. But somehow it rings hollow. In a digital age, it is hard to properly express how much was lost. How do you communicate the value of your deceased mom's journal from 1981 when she was pregnant with you? Or the textiles you collected when working in West Africa in your mid-20s? Or the boxes of home videos carefully labeled and organized, but not yet digitized, that captured moments of your family you had hoped to someday share with your own kids? My mom, a proud Palisadian, passed away in January 2020, 5 years ago to the day of the Palisades fire breaking out. She loved our small town traditions so much that even though she was Canadian, she decked herself out in the American flag to run the 4th of July 5K every year. She had lovingly renovated our home with my dad, her partner of 40 years. Losing that house in some ways feels like losing my mom all over again. My dad is staying with my sister right now until he can find a more permanent place, something that is proving more difficult than we initially expected with so many people in desperate situations and needing homes. When the fire broke out on Tuesday, my dad was at work and unable to get home to grab anything. Ever the optimist, he slept in his office the first night, and when he told me that he thought he'd probably get back home in a day or two, my heart just sank. By Thursday afternoon, we had photos and video evidence that the house was gone. And I mean, like, everything was gone. Hope. It can be such an exhausting thing. And I was actually really grateful to finally see the photos of the destruction instead of trying to imagine it. There would be nothing left to salvage, and we have started to mourn. Growing up in the Palisades of the 1980s and 90s, we were no strangers to natural disasters. We joke that we had 4 seasons: fire, mudslide, earthquake, and summer. My AYSO soccer team even named ourselves the Natural Disasters one year. While I knew of 1 or 2 families who were displaced by wildfires, the level of destruction the Palisades and Eaton fires have left us with today is unprecedented. The disasters we're seeing today are not natural. They are crimes. My elementary and middle school, our rec center, our library, the local community theater, the banks, the post office where we voted, the grocery stores, our favorite restaurants, they have all been taken out. Rows and rows of houses were unable to be protected because of the winds. I remember the Palisades pre-Caruso era, where a young family on a single fixed income could buy a house in the 80s and make a dream life there. Many of the people who have lost homes are not people who would be able to buy into the Palisades of today. Climate change and the impact of fossil fuel companies have truly upended our lives. At this moment, I can name over a dozen families who now have 3 generations displaced. 3 generations within a single family who have lost all their belongings, their homes, their memories, their children's schools and parks, their places of worship, their center. A few of those friends have reported that their insurance was denied renewal by State Farm, the only major company willing to insure the area at the time, in October 2024, so last October. And they were unable to get any other insurance besides California Fair Plan, coverage that cost more for less. Many of them think that they will end up with little to no insurance payout with which to rebuild. I fear that much of the culture of the community that I grew up in and loved and that shaped me will be lost due to this disaster. I'm really grateful for this platform to share my story and to amplify the voices of those who have lost so much. I believe we have a responsibility to the future generation to collectively come together and call out the injustice of fossil fuel companies who have contributed to these disasters. Thank you.
Thank you, Danielle. Really, really appreciate you being here under this kind of situation. Let's move on also to another LA contact here. We have Sam James from Altadena. Sam?
Hi, thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Sam James, and I am 24 years old. I'm currently a resident of Santa Monica, where I saw the Palisades fire out of my window, though I grew up in Altadena, where my family has lived for 5 generations. Our roots in Altadena and Pasadena area go back to at least 1890, with a legacy of building opportunities for Black generational wealth, primarily through home ownership. However, much of this progress has been destroyed by recent wildfires, including the Eaton fire, which destroyed the homes of several of my family members, including my grandfather's home and my father's backyard. As longtime Altadena residents, we have faced environmental challenges for decades, from pollution-related health disparities like asthma and lung diseases, which I struggle with to the increasing threat of wildfires that already disproportionately impact the Black and Brown community. While we've always understood the risks of living in this area, the severity of these fires has escalated dramatically due to climate change and the actions of big oil companies that have exacerbated this crisis. The fires I experienced as a child pale in comparison to the destruction that was caused by the Palisades and Eaton fires. Never in our wildest imaginations could we have thought that the flames would travel so far south and that so much of Pasadena or Altadena would be destroyed. Yet, despite this unimaginable loss, our community remains resilient. Through the Altadena Recovery Team, a newly founded crowdsourced initiative supported by community donations, we are working to help fire survivors heal and rebuild in our community. However, this is not our responsibility, and it should not continuously fall on us to address the consequences of big oil's negligence. Their reckless pollution and disregard for the environmental impact have directly contributed to climate change and the intensification of natural disasters like these wildfires. They must take responsibility for the harm that they've caused, pay reparations to the affected communities who lost their homes and businesses, and take immediate steps to mitigate further damage. The science is clear. We've seen the writing on the walls. Climate change is here, and it's only getting worse. Our communities cannot continue to bear the physical and emotional toll of this crisis caused by the actions of a powerful few. It's time for big oil to be held accountable and take real, measurable steps towards a more sustainable future. It begs the question, how much suffering will we have to bear witness to before big oil and other polluters take accountability for their actions and take steps to mitigate the harm that they have already done and the harm that we will inevitably experience in the future? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sam. I mean, you're speaking on behalf of a community that has already gone through so much, and I'm sure they're so proud of you for standing up right now. Christina Dahl is a climate scientist who's now with Climate Central as the Vice President for Science. Passing it to you, Christina.
Thanks so much, Clara. I want to first just acknowledge the bravery and clarity of thought that Sam and Danielle have brought today to describe just the devastation that they're experiencing in their lives and communities. And in that sense, my job today here as a climate scientist is an easy one. It's emotionally simple, right? These fires have not affected me personally or my family in San Francisco directly. And yet I listen to these stories and I'm reminded of why I've dedicated my career to addressing the climate crisis. Because as an idealistic 20-year-old graduate student, I hoped that we could avoid more people having stories like this to tell. And the reality is that no matter how much science we have done, no matter how many projections we have created, we are up against a very deep-pocketed fossil fuel industry that has made it very difficult to actually address the crisis. Just to turn to the science for a moment, in general, the science is very clear that hot, dry, fire-prone conditions are becoming more common in California and across the Western United States and Western Canada. And that's in large part because of human-caused climate change. These conditions are conducive to fire because they dry out the vegetation, and then that vegetation becomes tinder that burns very easily. Research that I published back in 2023 with my colleagues from the Union of Concerned Scientists and UC Merced found that over half of the increase in fire-prone conditions over the last century or so can be attributed to the emissions traced to just 88 fossil fuel companies and cement manufacturers around the world. That translates to a contribution to the total burned area since the 1980s of about 37% from just this set of companies. So science can tell us what that contribution has been, but it falls to the public and to the law to decide whether or how those emissions translate into financial responsibility. But I will say that, as a state, California has held corporations accountable for their role in wildfires. And yet, much of the financial burden is still falling to taxpayers and ratepayers. And the companies that are shaping the conditions under which these fires are occurring are largely left off the hook. For these events in LA specifically, we know that Southern California experienced relatively wet winters in 2023 and 2024, which enabled a lot of vegetation to grow. And different ecosystems in California have different responses to climate conditions. But in Southern California, there's actually a correlation between experiencing wet winters and having subsequently severe fire seasons. And that's because the vegetation these are not forests. This is more like grasslands and shrublands. And so that vegetation can grow very quickly when it's wet. And then if you experience a very dry, hot summer, like Southern California has experienced over the past 9 months or so, all that vegetation dries out and burns very easily and very quickly. This contrast between wet winters followed by very dry summers is something that the scientist Daniel Swain has very eloquently described as precipitation whiplash or hydroclimate whiplash. And it is one more hallmark of climate change in this part of the world and is a condition that we will increasingly see as climate change progresses. So more specific attribution studies that link climate change to these Los Angeles wildfires will undoubtedly be published in the coming days and months. And before we see those in-depth studies, it's difficult to comment on or precisely quantify just how much of a role climate change played in driving these fires. But the big picture is very clear, right? Climate change is driving all of the conditions, the heat, the dryness, the hydroclimate whiplash that are making these fires so much more dangerous and so much more destructive. Thank you.
Thank you, Christy, for being here. Really appreciate that insight. Now we're going to turn to Alan Myers and actually pivot from survivors of current fires to those that have experienced them in the past. And Alan specifically is from Paradise, California originally, and has spent the years since the Camp Fire, helping communities rebuild, not only in Paradise, but in other fire-prone areas, fire-struck areas around the country. So, Alan?
It's Clara. And I just want to first acknowledge Sam and Danielle. You're part of a club now that you never wanted to be a part of. But know that there are many of us who are here for you. There are lessons that we've learned since the fires that would want to share, and we grieve with you. I grew up in Paradise, California, and similar, we knew that there was fires there. It was something that's part of the ecosystem. On November 8th, 2018, a spark from PG&E set off the world's most costly disaster for that year, picked up by unseasonably powerful winds and pushed into extremely dry, low humidity fuel loads. It was those conditions that we can draw and point a line to the fossil fuel industry. The fingerprints of their neglect are all over our disaster and disasters around the world. Growing up in Paradise, we knew that by Halloween, we'd probably be rained out and there would be a wet Halloween and we'd go into a wet season. But that was not the case on November 8th. It was a small idyllic town in the mountains. And On that day, my family's home, every home I ever played in as a kid, the hospital I was born at, the schools I went to were immediately reduced to ash. And similar to Danielle, I don't know if there's adequate ways for us to explain that kind of loss, because yes, it is stuff. And yes, that is what the world is responding to and sending donations. But the things that we lost are most valuable because of the memories that they represent and the identity that we feel towards them. So in that way, there is an erasure of our identity when these disasters strike. For those that are protected with immense amounts of wealth, like the executives at Exxon and Shell and other fossil fuel corporations, they are protected from the losses that we feel. And for that, they do not act. These stories are essential to move people because there must be a change. These corporations are not going to change on their own. If they lose a house in the Bahamas because of a hurricane or a fire in LA, they move to another one. Their profits are their biggest priority. And so I am so grateful to Public Citizen and the lawsuit and the call for criminal action against the fossil fuel industry. PG&E was found guilty of manslaughter of 85 counts of people in my community because of their neglect. Yet the fossil fuel industry, which created the conditions for the fire, have avoided any culpability. It is time that they are held responsible for their role in the climate crisis around the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alan. Really appreciate it. Now we're going to turn to Margaret Coaster. Margaret, are you there? Well, in the meanwhile, let's actually go to another Altadena resident.
Sorry.
Oh,
Okay.
go
Sorry.
ahead.
No, I
Thank you.
forgot to unmute. Okay, let me quickly pull up. Okay, my name is Margaret Coster, like Foster, but it starts with a K. So I have lived in California all my life. The California has always been fire country. The reason for the increased frequency and very fire is clear. Why are we hotter and drier with stronger winds? Because of climate change caused by burning fossil fuel. I was evacuated during the 2017 Redwood Valley fire, which happened alongside the Tubbs fire in Santa Rosa. People I knew lost homes and businesses. Some lost their lives, including 2 teenage siblings who couldn't run fast enough. There was no electricity, no landline, no cell service, and no water for over a week. There remain long-lasting and widespread traumatic stress and health effects from the toxic smoke, including me. Even though I didn't lose my home, I was profoundly affected emotionally and still am. As with smoking and lung cancer, corporate industry had knowledge of the link between fossil fuels and climate disruption, but suppressed it. It took concentrated social, political, and legal pressure to force the tobacco companies to take action, and the same is true now with the fossil fuel companies. Fossil fuel corporations have known the risks from burning fossil fuels for over half a century and buried the evidence. Many people are becoming more aware, upset, and outraged about the unjustified power and control large corporations have over our lives and politics. I support Public Citizen's role in bringing accountability to the fossil fuel industry's crimes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Margaret. Really appreciate you being here today. All right, folks, so we have just a few minutes left in our presser, or rather in the scheduled time, but we have 2 more speakers. So I ask you to please be patient and stick around. We have the Maya coming to us from Altadena up next, and then we'll close with Aaron Regenberg, our legal policy expert here, who's going to go through the theories of accountability. So really important stuff. Please stick around. Maya?
Yeah, thank you so much. I live in Altadena, and I'm also Deputy Director of the Climate Law Institute at the Center for Biological Diversity and a lawyer with the center. And 10 days ago, I was sitting at my computer at home, ironically working on a polluters pay climate pill, when my power suddenly went out and we realized that we needed to evacuate. And we scrambled around trying to catch our cats in the dark, which is no small feat, and then drove to a closed Starbucks and huddled against the Santa Ana winds to try and use their Wi-Fi to find a place to stay for the night. We're still evacuated, but we are very lucky that we've been able to stay with friends and relatives. We're also very lucky that our house is still standing, although we don't know when we'll be able to go back or use the water, or if we need to clean out the toxic ash before we move in. So we have no idea kind of what this is going to look like going forward. This is the second time we've had to evacuate. Last time was the station fire in 2009 when we ran out with our then baby and toddler. As Sam mentioned earlier, this time is so much worse because the fire tore through the town, not just the forest. So much of our Altadena community is gone. Our friends' houses are gone. Our synagogue is in ashes. Our favorite pizza places, outdoor theater, gathering places, post office, maybe our vet, I don't know, much and so much more are all gone. And many of the shops and restaurants in Altadena are owned by locals who lost both their businesses and their homes. And I know that this quirky, diverse little community is never going to be the same. So I'm grieving and confused, and I'm also outraged at the failure to hold fossil fuel polluters accountable for the devastation they've caused by disrupting our climate. We know that California is a major historic producer that's also been home to dozens of billion-dollar climate disasters like these fires. And having inflicted as much as, or maybe more than $250 billion in damages, the LA fires already rank as one of the worst disasters in US history. Yet the fossil fuel polluters who rake in massive profits and have created the conditions for the fires, the floods, and the other disasters have faced no responsibility to pay for the consequences. And that leaves the rest of us stuck with the multi-billion-dollar tab. So one of my and my organization's top priorities this legislative session is to pass a California Climate Superfund bill. The bill is modeled on a federal law that requires hazardous waste polluters to clean up their toxic messes, and also on California's Childhood Lead Poisoning Prevention Act. It would make the largest fossil fuel polluters pay a portion of their huge profits to address the climate consequences they've helped create and help California adapt to future disasters. Vermont and New York actually have already passed similar bills last year. And in California, we're already paying for big oil's climate destruction, not just with money, but with our lives. So that's why we need our own climate superfund bill to put billions of dollars in climate costs back onto corporate polluters where they belong. Thank you.
Appreciate it, Maya. All right, let's wrap it up with Aaron Regenberg from Public Citizen.
Well, thanks, Clara. And, we are so grateful to everyone who shared their story. And we want to again thank all the journalists who joined today and who are, I know, working so hard right now to tell the full story about this crisis. We heard today from Dr. Dahl about the wildfires that have endangered Danielle and Sam and Alan and Margaret and Maya and so many others that they didn't happen out of the blue, right? There have always been fires. There have always been sparks that start fires. There always will be. But climate change is what transformed the sparks that started these fires into the raging conflagrations that have destroyed so much. And climate change didn't happen out of the blue either, right? The climate effects driving these fires are the direct and foreseeable and in fact foreseen consequences of the actions of a small number of fossil fuel companies that knowingly generated a huge portion of all the greenhouse gas emissions that caused this crisis, and fraudulently deceived the public about the dangerousness of their products, specifically in order to block and delay the very solutions that could have avoided these catastrophes. What's more, they did all of this with full knowledge of just how lethal their conduct really was, having long predicted that the continued burning of their fossil fuel products would cause, in their own words, quote, catastrophic climate harms that would do, quote, irreversible harm to our planet, that would, quote, have serious consequences for man's comfort and survival, that would create, quote, more violent weather, more storms, more droughts, more deluges, and that would cause, quote, suffering and death due to thermal extremes. Their words. I mean, these corporations were so confident in their climate predictions, they used them to make major business decisions, right? They were raising the height of their offshore drilling platforms for the sea level rise they knew was coming. And all the while, they were telling the public the exact opposite. Now, I'm a lawyer, and we have a concept in the law for when someone consciously disregards a substantial risk of causing harm to another person. That is called recklessness. And that's what we mean when we say that while these injuries and deaths and losses are unspeakably tragic, they aren't just tragedies. They're also crimes. If you or I had engaged in reckless conduct that led to Danielle or Alan's house getting burned down, you can bet we would face consequences, right? Whether through civil litigation or criminal prosecution. And we're here today to say that those principles should apply to big oil in the exact same way. The victims and survivors of climate disasters deserve justice. And fortunately, we have mechanisms to give it to them, right? We have new legislative frameworks like the Climate Superfund bill that Maya discussed. We have the civil justice system, which is designed to repair harms and compensate those who've been injured. And that is exactly what cities and states all across the country, including California, are seeking with their climate accountability lawsuits, which continue to move forward and just this week overcame another dismissal attempt by big oil at the Supreme Court. And we also have the criminal justice system, which is designed to protect citizens from harm and hold wrongdoers accountable, right? Did you know, for example, it's a felony in California to recklessly cause a fire. It's involuntary manslaughter to recklessly cause a death. Local prosecutors should consider whether big oil's conduct here amounts to violations of these kinds of criminal laws, which, by the way, would mean under the state's criminal restitution statute that these companies could be made to directly compensate the victims of these disasters. The reason we have these kinds of laws, Superfund laws, civil justice laws, criminal laws, is to protect us from dangerous actors who would do us harm. It is difficult to imagine anything more dangerous or harmful than big oil's generation and fraudulent cover-up of the climate forces that have in so many ways created this staggering catastrophe. And it's time for all our public officials, our state legislators, our local councilors, our county prosecutors, and everyone in between to act accordingly. So we want to again thank everyone who's joined, everyone who's shared their stories. We can hang around if there are any questions that folks have. But again, we're grateful to the folks who have taken time under such difficult circumstances to share with us today.
Indeed, let's give all of our survivors a round of applause. It takes immense courage to come together at this time. Thank you so much. Questions, and we'll prioritize reporter questions. I know we have a few other friends online, but please raise your hand and go ahead or come off mute and ask your question. There's a lot of folks here, so I don't want to miss a hand.